Hey guys, back on the IS200 today. Now we stripped the car back to a shell and we painted the bay. Now next thing on the list is wiring. So I've stripped out all of the wiring out of the car and I've dropped about 100 kilos, if not more. So we took out all that weight, but the problem is now there's no wiring in the car, so none of the lights and accessories and things like that work. So what I've done here is I've created a full sort of race car level harness, and that's gonna plug into all the accessories on the car. Come in and let's have a look. So this is what I've come up with, and at its heart, we've got a ECU Master PMU 16. In this car, being that it's gonna be at the track a lot and there'll be diagnosis and quick thinking and things like that at the track, I didn't want to be stuck with fuses and relays and thinking, you know, is a relay bad, has a fuse blown, things like that. So what the PMU 16 is gonna do is it's gonna replace all of that. Now, I'll dig into that further in a minute, but now let's go over what we've made. So I've made a full harness for the car, and it's split into sections. So this is like the interior and front section, this is like around the rear seat and the fuel pump, and then this is the harness that goes into the boot and runs the tail lights. Pretty much everything on the car has its own breakout connector, and I'm gonna go through and show you how I made all of this just using some simple materials. Now, in terms of materials, you really don't need a lot. So I've got some wire here. You'll need a few different gauges and sizes and things like that. Now I'm using mil-spec Tefcel wire. That's pretty much the industry standard in terms of what you use. The spec is called M22759, but you can get away with something cheaper if the budget doesn't allow. And then for sleeving it, you've got a couple options. We're using heat shrink, but you can also use some braided sleeve or wire wrap or even Tessa tape, cloth tape. So that pretty much covers how we're making the harness. And then in terms of connectors, you're gonna need whatever connectors are in your car. So there's two options here. Either you can go out and get something like this, which is a bunch of Deutsch connectors. Now these are universal and you can pretty much make them work with anything. Or your other option is that you can go out and buy all factory connectors that work with your car and remake the harness all with the factory plugs. Option 3 is you can take your existing harness and cut the plugs off and tie them into the new harness. Now I'll cover both of those things and how you sort of do those, how you use existing plugs and how you use new Deutsch plugs. Now other miscellaneous things you'll need: multimeter to figure out what wires do what. Also need some Kapton tape to wrap inside the harness, a marker to write where things go, tape measure or a ruler to take some lengths, and then these are pretty much all the hand tools. So I've got two styles of crimp connector here. Now these are pretty much the be all and end all. These will do most of the things that are in the harness. And then you need a closed barrel crimp. So this is an open barrel style, which I'll delve into more. And then you've got a closed barrel style, or you can use this specific Deutsch crimper. So some crimpers, wire stripper. Now since I'm using the Tefcel wire, you do need this sort of style of wire stripper that cuts the wire instead of pulls it. But if you're using cheaper wire, you can get away with just some cheap wire strippers. And then a pick tool just in case you need to do any de-pinning or finicky work. Last thing you need is some cutters just to cut the wires to length. Now that's pretty much it. Now if you're going with the heat shrink route, you'll need a heat source to shrink the heat shrink. I just use a heat gun, but you can also use like propane or some sort of flammable thing. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, like I was saying, we are not going to be running any fuse boxes or relays in the whole car, just to make it very serviceable at the track and very easy to work on. So this is the combination we've got for control. So we've got a Blink Marine keypad. Now these are also sold as like a Link keypad or an ECU Master keypad and plenty other names, but they're actually made by a company called Blink Marine. That's the part number there if you need it. And now the PMU 16, what that's going to do is replace all the fuses and relays in the car. So traditionally you would have all of your inputs, so like let's say for example your windshield wipers, you would have the inputs from the stalk go into the fuse box would trigger a relay and then it would go out to the windshield wiper. Now what the PMU 16 is going to do is it has a network, so there's only two wires here. You set up whatever inputs you want on this. So let's say we want to turn the windshield wipers on, we'll press this button. The PMU 16 will internally say, let's turn on the wipers, and it'll just send a signal out. So that means all of your fuse box and wiring is condensed down to this one single plug, so it makes it nice and easy and neat.
I made a document and it actually tells me what each pin on the PMU does and where it needs to be wired to. So for example, I know that my headlights need to go to PMU output 7, and then I've got a pin out here that shows me which pin that is. From there, all I've done is I've just made a list of the runs that I need to make and what size wire I'm going to use. So I've made this little diagram that looks like a spider, and it basically just tells me from my PDM I need to have a run here, a run there, and a run there. So it makes everything nice and simple. All we've got is a bunch of connectors. So now these are Deutsch connectors. We're using a combination of DTPs, DTs, and DTMs. So they're three different sizes. So the DTs are the standard size, DTM is a mini, and a DTP is for high current like fuel pumps. Now we've got some bulkheads. So the main battery power needs to pass through the firewall, and this is what we're going to use for that. So you basically just put one side to the battery and one side to, for example, the alternator. Then we've got our wire. So we're using Tefcell wire here. This is the proper mil-spec wire for automotive. And we've got a few different sizes and colors. Basically, 16 gauge you'll use for anything that has high current power. So for example, like a regular size fuel pump, or you can power your headlights off it. And then the 18 gauge will be for anything with a little bit less current. So we're using LED lights. So all of our LEDs will get powered with 18 gauge. And then the 20 gauge is for your low current power, and the 22 gauge is for your sensors. So pressure sensors and our pedal position and things like that, that'll all be in 22 gauge. And then you can also use 20 gauge for the same purpose. So any of your sensors or low current devices can go with 20 gauge. All of your 5 volts and your grounds can also be in 20 gauge.
All right, so what I've done is I've actually taken note of how many millimeters from each junction point certain things are. So what that looks like in the car, I've got Tony here holding up a tube front end for me. What that looks like in the car is I've just taken a bit of scrap wire, and I'm actually just running, so if you look at the green wire, I've put a little bit of tape every so often just to hold it in place. Using that, I've just made a jig, and the green wire goes from the PDM, runs down the side of the car, and then our first branch point is here in the back. So we're gonna have a harness that tees off here and runs to our factory fuel hanger, as well as the lights for the roll cage. And so I've just put a mount for it there, and then it runs up through this hole, goes into the boot, and then we've got a T here that's gonna power our surge tank, as well as our air compressor and our tail light. And then it runs down back here, and there's a junction for this side tail light, and then it runs along across, and then there's another junction for this side tail light. So with that green wire, we know from this point, our surge tank is 300 millimeters away, and our air tank is 400 millimeters away. And in here, we know from this flag point, our fuel tank is 300 millimeters away, our wheel speed sensor is 400 millimeters away. So using those flag points, I know exactly where my harness is gonna run, and I can do it all off the car on the bench, and then just put it in the car at the end.
Okay, now that I've got the harness all sleeved with the captain tape and supported and ready to finish, all I'm going to do is cover it. So there's 2 things you can use. I'm using heat shrink. Now the correct stuff to use is Raychem DR25, but what you can also use is just braided sleeve or Tessa tape if you want to do it cheap and easy. But this part's super easy. All you do, take off anything protruding. So in my case, there's a little bit of green tape left over on this bit. Alright, so I've got the bare wires, and this being a pair, I've just twisted them together, which makes it a little bit easier to slide the heat shrink over. I've got my piece of heat shrink cut to length, and all I'm doing is sliding it over. Alright, so now we've got our rear seat area, that's all sleeved. But what I'm going to do is start from that side, sleeve all this, and that'll bring me to here. And then I can just cut one length of heat shrink from there all the way back to the PDM. It'll make sense when I put it together. I'm going to sleeve all this, and then I'll touch base. Alright, so this main trunk ended up being way harder to do than I expected. So the biggest size of heat shrink that I had was only slightly bigger than the harness. So slipping, 2 meters of heat shrink over got very, very difficult, and I had to use some tricks with like spraying brake cleaner in there and stuff to make it slippery, but I did get there in the end. So this is the final bit. I've got a bit of length left on the end to pin into the PDM. That main trunk will run down the side of the car. The rear seat, it's going to split off the roll cage lights, the factory fuel pump and fuel level sensor, and then we've got our wheel speed sensor, and then it'll go down to the back. This is our 2 fuel pumps in the surge tank, our air compressor, our air cups and our air cup pressure, and then our tail lights. Now, one other thing I did just to the boot, I put a spare 16 gauge. It doesn't go to anything, I don't have any purpose for it yet, but down the line, if I add something to the car, like if I end up adding nitrous or if I add another thermofan or something in the back, I won't have to chop up the whole harness or run a wire externally. I've just got a spare one in here that I can assign at any time.
All right, so the next step in the process is going to be to take all these separate trunks that we made in the harness and actually shrink them down, because I'm not sure exactly how much length I'm going to need. What I'm going to do is put the connectors on first, and then I'm going to heat shrink it after. So basically we have our 4 wires, and the way they work is one is a brake light, one is a tail light, and then one is our hazards. So we've got a 4-pin Deutsch connector, and that's going to allow us to put a ground in there as well. So one thing to remember, when you have a Deutsch connector, you've got a male and a female side. So the thing to remember is female pins in a male connector and male pins in a female connector. I'm just going to cut all the wires to the same length. So the wire in the 18 gauge, then we have a nice little length stripped. Then we take our Deutsch terminal, slide it in, grab our crimpers. Now we're using open barrel crimpers for these open barrel crimps. Pretty much everything in this harness is using these Deutsch connectors. Now some of them are the Deutsch mini connectors, which are a little bit smaller, and some of the DTP connectors, which are a little bit bigger for high current, but the crimping process is the same on every single connector. So I'm gonna crimp all these and then I'll show you the next step. So what we do is recover our heat shrink. So we take a heat gun and we pretty much just go up and down the whole thing until the heat shrink is all shrunk and nice and tight with our wire. And then once it's shrunk, is take our dual wall heat shrink. Now this stuff is glue lined and it's gonna stop moisture and elements and anything from getting into the harness. So you always end your harness with some dual wall heat shrink and pretty much heat it up till you see the glue start oozing out. And the last thing you do is take your label, heat shrink that, and then we just take our clear, and all the clear really does is it protects the label, text coming off the label, and then that is that end of the harness terminated. Now, what you may be thinking is, gee, my car doesn't have all these fancy Deutsch connectors on it. It's got all these janky old factory connectors on it. How can I make that work? So let me show you what to do here. So what you do is you take your factory connector and you cut it off the car, and now we can work on joining it together. Now this is our new fuel pump hanger wires, and obviously this is the ones out of the old hanger. So what we're gonna do is de-pin this connector and then connect it on here. Now ideally you would get new pins, put the new pins on these, and then pop the pins straight in. But that's not a luxury we have today. So all you do is pop the clip off and the pin comes out. So this is our fuel pump power wire. Take a little bit of heat shrink, slip it over the wire, and then we're going to take one of these wire-to-wire crimps. These are really easy to use because they have a double-sided crimp, so you can just crimp one end, wait, get it close to the other end, and they make it really easy for beginners like me. And then all you do is we take the same open barrel crimpers, crimp down on one side, take it over to our harness, and from the fuel pump power. That's our 3 wires for our factory fuel hanger, all joined up. All we're going to do is heat shrink these down, slip our heat shrink and dual wall over, shrink those, and then pin it back into the connector. Just like that, we've got our factory fuel pump plug off to our main harness, as well as a ground terminal, and then that's ready to go. That's going to have fresh PDM power, and it's going to give fuel level to our M-Tron ECU. Okay, so when we get to a trunk in the harness like this, where all of our sub-harnesses branch off, what I do is get a piece of dual wall heat shrink, slide that over, take a small cable tie. Now that's going to group all the wires neatly, and then recover your heat shrink. Now that joint is now sealed. The glue in the dual wall will seep into the joint. As I said, you can also use a TE rubber boot, but for our case, we're just going to be using heat shrink. Now the point of the zip tie is if any of these wires get pulled on sideways like this, the zip tie is going to keep all the strain in this main trunk instead of passing it through to this heat shrink and potentially ripping the heat shrink. All right, and then we have it. So that is our full main chassis harness. All that's left is we've got to pin this to the PDM. Now, if you're using a PDM, all you'll do is pin that. If you're using a fuse box, this is where you put your fuses and relays. But yeah, here it is. So we've got our main trunk that goes out and it splits off at the rear seat, which goes to our wheel speed sensor, our stock fuel hanger, and this is the lights for our roll cage. And then the harness keeps going down and it goes to the boot of the car. So we have our breakout connector for our air cups, we've got our breakout connector for our air compressor, and then the breakout connector for our fuel pump. Then it all goes all the way back to the tail lights. So we've got our driver's side tail light and our passenger side tail light. Now all we'll do is go in the car, start putting Deutsch connectors on everything, and then we can just plug it in and away we go. So what we know here, our colors make it a little bit easier because we know our fuel pump tank uses a 16 gauge wire, which is red. So we know that one of these 4 red wires is our fuel pump wire, but the color doesn't really matter, and I'll show you why. So to figure out what color does what, we've got our multimeter here set to continuity, and we've got our 2 probes. So what we're gonna do is take the connector for our fuel pump. We're gonna stick one of our probes into this pin, and now, as soon as we touch the corresponding wire on the other end, it's gonna beep. So it's not that one, not that one. That's our wire. And now we know this wire is our fuel pump tank wire. We look at our pin out again and we can see that output 1 is one of the big 25 amp outputs. Strip our wire, take one of these terminals off the reel, grab our crimpers, crimp that tight. All we're gonna do is take the back of the connector, position it, and slide it in. So now all we're gonna do from here, go on our computer, pick the next thing to do. So like next thing I'm going to do is my tail lights, and then just take the multimeter and start probing tail light harnesses here. So I'll take a multimeter, probe that, and then just probe every single wire here. That's why it doesn't matter what color the wires are, because you're literally just going to touch every wire till one beeps, and then that's your wire. Pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to pin all of these wires and then we'll go on to the next step. To control the whole car, instead of using a bunch of switches and buttons and stuff like that, we have this CAN keypad. Now it's super simple. There's only 4 wires coming out of the back. So So we've got power, ground, CAN high, and CAN low. Now CAN is sort of, think of it like a Discord server, but for all of the parts of your car. So basically, the CAN keypad will send a request. So like, let's say you press this button, and this button is your fuel pump on. So the CAN keypad will send a request into the Discord chat that says, turn the fuel pumps on. And then the PDM will be like, all right, turn the fuel pump on. And that's how it works. So instead of having a bunch of wires, 24 different wires running through the car just for switches, it all just communicates over these two wires on a network. So it makes the wiring super simple. And the way you wire this is you need to have a pair of CAN high and CAN low. So we're gonna have purple as our CAN high and white as our CAN low. Now, the way you wire a CAN bus is the wires need to be twisted over a very short run. Like if you just have a run that long, if it's not twisted, it won't matter. But over a long distance, you can start getting interference and signal issues if you don't twist the wires. So the trick here is what you do, take your wire and then you take some sort of clamp and just clamp your wire to the table. Vice, that'll work a lot better. And then what you do is you grab a power drill, insert the other end of the wire into the drill and tighten it. Slowly turn the drill up and hold tension on it. So make sure you're pulling it tight, starting to get a twist. Now you can see it started knotting up here, and that's a good sign that it's tight enough. Then you just undo it, and now you've got a beautiful twisted pair of wires, and that's great for your CAN bus. Now, one thing you can do while it's all stretched out is take your heat gun and just run your heat gun along the length of it. Now, what you'll find is when I let go of this wire, instead of curling up like it was, it'll just flop straight down. And now it's not gonna tangle up or anything, the wire is completely straight. That's how you do your CAN bus wires.
All right, so it's all done now. That's all the wires in. It's not a full concentric twist, but it is definitely twisted and should provide some strain relief. And then I've got all my branches out. And then the way I've done the ground is I've got a separate wire. Now, I've just got one 16 gauge wire. That's going to be my main ground. And then in the harness, I've actually branched it off to 20 gauge wires. So I'll just have one grounding point somewhere on the inside under the dash. And then the harness will all be grounded internally through that. All right, so I've just actually finished the whole harness. So basically, we've turned all of these individual parts into something beautiful like this. Now, you might notice that there are a few cables that aren't sleeved. So like this one, for example, is actually the USB to CAN, and that's how you program the PMU16. And then this, I just ran out of heat shrink, so I'll quickly sleeve this before I put it in the car. And then all that's left is any wire that's currently unterminated. I just haven't figured out what plug I'm gonna put on it. But yeah, other than that, it's pretty much done. So last thing you have to do with your custom wiring is make your sub harnesses. So we've got our main harness that ends with a Deutsch connector, and then we've got our sub harness that goes from the Deutsch connector up to the surge tank. So we've got our driver's side tail light. Out of the tail light we have another Deutsch connector, and that will just plug straight in. Let's go around the car, make all the sub harnesses if you have them. These aren't necessary, you can actually just wire the tail light straight into the harness, but it makes life a little bit easier in terms of serviceability. So I've still got to do a little bit of cable management, as you can see, but the run is pretty simple. Harness comes off the PDM, runs down here along the side of the car, up, down, along to the back seat, where it tees off to our factory fuel pump, wheel speed sensor, roll cage lights, and then comes through there into the boot and subs off into our little sub harnesses. And then on the front, we just have our little headlight harness, another wheel speed sensor, and a plug for the thermo fans. It's all the wiring done. So setting up the PDM is very, very simple. Once everything's connected, you just open up the PMU software. Every PDM is different, but this is how you do this one. And you literally just add a power output. You basically give it a name, pick which pin it's on. You can set a max current as like a digital fuse, and then you pick how you want to turn that on. So if you want to turn it on via the keyboard, you would just pick one of your keyboard buttons and then you press OK, and that will make that power up. Now you can do what's called a formula and get very in depth with how you want to turn things on and off. You can keep adding formulas over and over and over, but that's a whole video on its own. So that's how you set up PDM, and that's it. Alright, so I've made this little switch panel that goes where the factory head unit is. Once everything's configured in the PMU side, you just assign what you want your buttons to do. I've also put a kill switch in here that turns the car on, and then I've got my window switches. That's the startup sequence, and you can assign all the colors and things like that in the software. And then what you can get is these little covers, and they simply just snap in and they tell you what buttons which. Popped a couple buttons in there now, and this is how they work. You basically just press a button, and now that output's on. Now that's my hazard switch, so it goes orange when you turn it on. That's my headlight switch. You can basically assign them to do whatever you want, flash, change colors, whatever. The software is very, very in-depth. There's a bunch of stuff you can do, and the other thing you can do is monitor things. So for example, if I turn that on and we look at the channel for the blinkers, we can see that they are blinking and they're drawing about 3 amps, and you can actually monitor every little thing, how many amps it's drawing. If something shorts out, you'll see that there's an overcurrent warning. And then the other thing you can do is wire in all your inputs. So I've got my fuel level wired, and we can see that I've got around 35 litres of fuel in it.
All right, so that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching. I want to give a massive shout out to Ryan from Race Concepts. He helped me with getting all the connectors, getting all the materials, and all of the logic and things like that with making the harness. Head over to his website or hit him up on Instagram. Everything in this video is available straight from him. Now in the next video, we're going to get this Mammoth 2J in, start doing all the fab work. I'll run you guys through how to do all of that. And then from there, we'll get onto the first start and we'll get on the dyno.